Hi, I'm Marty Nemko. One way to improve our ethics is to examine arguments on both sides of common ethical dilemmas, and here are 9. I'm going to kind of truncate the arguments so that we don't spend too much time here, but hopefully this will still serve its purpose to encourage folks to not overweight expediency relative to other considerations, including what I call universal cosmic justice. The first ethical dilemma: should you terminate an employee who has cancer? Let's say you're a manager at a nonprofit and your supervisee has been a planned giving fundraiser there for 5 years. 4 years ago, his performance was poor because he was undergoing chemotherapy. And since then, it's improved to average. But in the past few months, his performance has declined severely again. He's raised only half as much money as before. He explains that his cancer has recurred and has spread to his lymph nodes, so he's in the middle of a 6-month round of chemotherapy, and his prognosis is not good. He says he prefers to keep working, but if you terminate him, he won't file a claim under the Americans with Disabilities Act. He is his family's sole source of income, and his nonprofit salary is modest, so he has little in savings. He's just getting by. The ethical question: do you retain him? An argument for retaining him is that most organizations, but especially nonprofits, espouse putting people above profits. To let him go when he's been an acceptable performer and now has to endure treatment for recurred cancer would be hypocritical, especially since he's his family's sole support, and he's saved little because he's worked for nonprofits. From a pragmatic standpoint, letting him go would hurt the organization's morale, and besides, with his cancer having recurred and is in his lymph nodes, it's unlikely he'd want or be able to stay employed for very long. Retaining him would be an appropriate, quote, cost of doing business. An argument against retaining him is this: less money raised means less services to the many needy people that nonprofit services. He's only one person. Yes, he's an employee, but the wise manager, the wise person, makes decisions mainly based on what will do the most good, not giving extra consideration to the person in front of you. You can mitigate the toll to staff morale by telling the employees the ethical basis for letting him go and giving them ample opportunity to process that. To help this guy financially, you might give a generous severance package. That would still save much money compared with keeping him on. So, what would you do? And would your decision be different if it were a small company rather than a nonprofit? A large company, the government. Ethical dilemma 2. Do you abort your child who has Down syndrome? We are going to assume here that you're 4 months pregnant and an ultrasound reveals that your baby will have Down syndrome. Do you keep the baby or abort? An argument for keeping the baby: to abort a Down's child is to kill a future person who can likely live a decent life, and from a selfish perspective, Down's children often are unusually sweet. An argument for aborting the baby: having a Down syndrome child will dramatically impede your career and personal life. And if you abort that child, you can choose to have another, who likely will be normal. In either case, you're bringing one child into the world. Why not bring one in who will live a more enriched life and allow you to live yours? So, what would you do? Third ethical dilemma: do you cut into a lane? Every day, your commute back home requires you to exit from a 2-lane road onto a freeway. To do so, you must be in the right lane. But that right lane backs up for 2 miles, adding 20 minutes to your daily commute. You're tempted to stay in the left lane, which moves much more quickly, and then, right before the freeway on-ramp, cut ahead of the cars that have been waiting the 20 minutes. Do you cut in? An argument for cutting in is this: unlike some of the drivers, you're exhausted from a full workday, and when you get home, you're going to need to have the equanimity to listen to your family, break up family fights, be present for your spouse, and so on. To sit in that gridlock for that 20 minutes every day makes you a worse spouse and parent. An argument for staying in that slow right lane: many other people also would be more effective human beings if they didn't have to sit in that right lane for 20 minutes. Even if your rationale is more compelling than some of theirs, the lesson you then give to other drivers that selfishness pays imposes too great a social cost. So, what would you do? Ethical dilemma number 4. Is a salesperson ethically obliged to reveal his product's core weakness? Let's assume here you sell new Chevys. A prospect is deciding between a Chevy Cruze and a Mazda 3. The prospect tells you that reliability is the number one criterion in choosing the car. She says, I hate getting into my car to go to work and then it won't start, or the vulnerability of being on the side of the road waiting for the tow truck. She thinks that the Chevy is more reliable than the Mazda. You think she's wrong, but you aren't sure. You're thinking of checking Consumer Reports and letting the customer know what you find. An argument for checking and reporting is this. If you do find that the Mazda is more reliable, you'll likely save the prospect much anxiety. She'll buy the Mazda, which she'll feel more confident in, and the car will, in fact, be less likely to break down. Of course, you can cite any benefits that the Chevy has over the Mazda. An argument for not checking and reporting is this. It's unrealistic to expect a salesperson to do research that will likely eliminate the possibility of a sale. If that would be the case, the Chevy salesperson would probably sell few cars. That will both cut the dealer's income and result in the salesperson getting fired and be less likely to obtain another job to support the family. If in a subsequent job interview that person is asked why she lost the previous job and says, because I keep doing research for prospective customers that reveals that my company's cars are inferior, she may never get hired for a sales job and have to train for a new career. It is ethical for a salesperson to not do such research for the customer, but rather listen to their needs and point out any relevant advantages the Chevy has over the Mazda. So, what would you do? Would the customer's gender, attractiveness, or age affect your decision? Would your decision be different if the salesperson were pitching for donations for a charity, even though that salesperson suspects that a competing charity does more good with the money? Ethical dilemma number 5. When you're desperate, is it worth lying to land a job? We're going to say you're a soft-skilled employee. You're not technical and have gotten by on being organized and well-liked. After having been laid off, you've looked hard for a job, but it's now been 10 months and you've received no offers. You've exhausted your savings and are now just 2 months from being unable to pay the rent. You could move back in with your parents, but then your child would have to change schools to a worse school. You know that the longer you're unemployed, the harder it will be to convince an employer to hire you. You'd be increasingly viewed as having been picked over. No one else wants to hire you, so why should they? So you're wondering if you should lie on your resume and say you're working and ask your friend if it's okay to list him as the boss. An argument for lying. Many jobs require just soft skills, and you're good at them and so deserve a job. But with that gap in employment, it's really hard to land one. So if you leave that gap on your resume, you'll lose the apartment, have to live with your parents, will be hard on them, and your child will have to change schools, which will mean she'll get a worse education and be around worse kids. Not to mention, she'd lose her current friends. That small lie is more than compensated for by the benefit. Now, here's an argument against lying. You're being unfair to the honest job applicant who thereby would be denied the job. Yes, it's possible that person needs the job less than you do, but that's far from certain. Also, the fact that you've not been selected despite 10 months of trying suggests that you may not be as worthy an employee as you think you are. It's wiser to look inward and to get some honest feedback so you can improve your skills or change careers to one in which you'd more likely be hired. So, what would you do? The 6th ethical dilemma is there ever justification for hiding money from your spouse? You've been married for 5 years and live in a city with high cost of living. You made nearly all the income, and because that's been a real strain, you begged your spouse to find a job. You say, the stress is killing me, but it's been to no avail. Your spouse made only half-hearted efforts, which not surprisingly failed. You were quite sure your spouse sabotaged your efforts to land a job because he or she didn't want to work. After 3 years, you were increasingly sure the marriage won't last, and so you hid $25,000 by giving it to your mom for safekeeping. Now you're divorcing, and although $75,000 remains in a joint account, which would get split, according to community property laws, a friend tells you to put that $25,000 back in the pot to be divided with your spouse in the divorce settlement. An argument for putting that $25,000 into the pot is this. When you decided to marry, you knew that the law requires that in divorce your spouse gets half the money no matter who earned it. And even if before marrying you didn't know your spouse would earn no income, if that indeed was a deal breaker, you should have initiated divorce when you realized that, which would have allowed both of you to more quickly move on to a mutually agreeable relationship. An argument for not putting the $25,000 into the pot is this. From a universal justice perspective, you deserve that money. You earned it. And your spouse, who claimed in marrying you to love you forever, despite your begging, "The stress is killing me," she refuses, or he refuses to work. And unless your income is unusually high, it's untenable after taxes to live in a major city or suburb on just one income. From that cosmic justice perspective, it is unjust for that non-earner to get $12,500 on top of the having been supported for 5 years, plus the $37,500 she'd get from the joint account's assets. So, what would you do? The seventh ethical dilemma is this. On a dating website, is it ever ethical to make yourself seem younger than you are? You're older, been single a long time, and are lonely. You're frustrated that it seems that almost all the good potential romantic partners want someone younger. You think, if only they'd give me a chance, they'd see I bring a lot to the relationship, even if I have wrinkles. So you're wondering if, like many people, should your profile say you're younger than you are and include only a distant photo so your age isn't apparent? An argument for lying about your age is this. What really counts is what's inside of you, and if you have to lie to overcome unreasonable ageism, why not? That would result in both you and the other person getting into a good relationship that otherwise wouldn't have occurred. An argument against lying. People should be allowed to make choices based on the truth. If a person wants a younger partner because of a chemical attraction, is afraid that an older spouse would be culturally different, or gets sick sooner, that's their right. Also, lying about age builds your relationship on a lie, which typically leads to more lies. And all that assumes you don't get discovered. It's likely that at the first date, if you look older than your stated age or fuzzy picture implies, the person will distrust you and probably discontinue the relationship, even if he or she otherwise enjoyed your company. So, what would you do? Ethical dilemma number 8. Is it always wise to be a whistleblower? Your coworkers routinely pad their expense accounts. Do you blow the whistle? An argument for telling your boss is this. Except in an unusual circumstance, stealing is unethical. A society in which property is unjustifiably wrested, taken away, cannot survive. Even if the company makes plenty of money and underpays you, that's insufficient justification for stealing. The appropriate response is to ask for a raise and or look for an employer who will treat you fairly, treat you better. An argument for not telling your boss is this. A few employees padding an expense account has minimal impact on most organizations' bottom line. And study after study shows that whistleblowers normally lose their jobs and have a hard time finding new work. For a relatively venial sin, is it worth jeopardizing your and your family's financial security? Besides, many organizations and their leaders make far more money than the workers. That's unjust. Not ratting on your coworkers is merely a bit of justifiable Robin Hooding, income redistribution. So what would you do? Would your decision be different if it were your boss padding his or her expense account? Would it matter if it were a small company versus a large company, a non-profit, or a government agency? If so, why? The ninth ethical dilemma. If you're terminal, do you ever have an obligation to end your life? You have stage 4 cancer, end stage, and you have poor quality of life, so you're wondering if you should off yourself. Here's an argument in favor. Even with copays, your family is probably losing its financial security paying for your care, for example, in assisted living or home nursing and domestic health. And the more care people get, the more expensive insurance premiums will be for everyone. Plus, there's a shortage of doctors, nurses, and so on. If it's spent on hopeless cases, there's not enough access for people who could profit more. That's something that every war medic knows. Triage is necessary to make the biggest difference. And you know that if you continue with treatment, chances are you'll need expensive palliative surgery, drugs, etc., and still only live a short, low-quality time. You're well aware that most people spend most healthcare dollars in their life's last 6 months. Here's an argument against. You can't be expected to be that self-sacrificial. You're entitled to live as long as you decide it's worth it. Society has enough money to pay for good health care. If it chooses to spend on other things, that doesn't mean you have an obligation to kill yourself. Give yourself a break. You've suffered enough in your illness. You shouldn't feel the need to donate your life. The savings in the system would be trivial. The savings to the system would be trivial. And with regard to your family spending down their resources, shouldn't they have the freedom to decide what to do with their money? So, what would you do? Anyway, thank you for watching and considering these ethical, tough issues, no question. There is a text version of this on Psychology Today. You can find it by simply Googling the term ethical dilemmas and perhaps the word Nemko. It's had 50,000 views, which is unusually large for my work, so perhaps it's unusually useful, and I hope it will be for you. Again, I'm Marty Nemko, and thank you for watching.